On a cool September evening in 1897, Dr. Jared Knapp Smith was writing down a letter to his beloved fiancée, Margaret Brewer. He was at his home right across the street from where our church is right now. Behind these houses that you see across the street, he was living with his two sisters and so excited to be marrying his beloved. He was 47 years old. He grew up right here in Kōloa like his 8 siblings. Well, actually, 2 of them died in infancy, but all who lived were born and raised right here across the street, and this was their playground. He was sitting down, writing her a love letter. At 47 years old, this was a little late for a man to be getting married for the first time. But Jared Knapp Smith wasn't just a regular old guy. His dad was the Reverend Dr. James Smith, and his mother was Millicent Smith, that faithful couple who left New England in 1842 and came to Kōloa so that James could be the only Western-trained medical doctor for all of Kauai and Niihau. And his parents served this community like it was nobody's business. Jared Knapp Smith grew up in that home and in this environment and took on that same work ethic. He went to school and graduated from college and medical school in New England and came back to Kauai to take his father's place. He was the only Western-trained doctor on the island for all of Kauai and Niihau. And he not only devoted himself 100% to the physical health of the people of this island, mostly native Hawaiians, but he also started a school right across the street next to their home called Kōloa Industrial School for boys. And he realized that even though a few years earlier his family had started the Kōloa boarding school for girls, that many of the boys on the island and also on Niihau didn't have the same opportunities as many other people, such as in Honolulu. And he said, we need to teach academics, we need to teach agriculture, we need to teach trade to these young Hawaiian boys that are going to be men and leaders in this community someday. Well, between having a full-fledged medical practice for the entire 2 islands and running a school, he just didn't have time for much else. Extracurricular activities, dating. But then he met Margaret Brewer, who shared his passion for education. She was the principal of Punahou School in Honolulu, and when he met her, he fell madly in love. So here he was on that cool September evening, writing a love letter to his beloved Margaret, when all of a sudden he heard something on his porch. And this was the porch to his room. Now, since he was the only medical doctor, if you had a medical emergency at night, you knew which door on that house to knock on. And so he thought he heard a knock but wasn't quite sure. So he shouted out, "Who's there?" And then, not hearing anyone, he went to the door, opened it, looked outside. It was all dark. And he thought he heard a cough or a grunt. So he turned back to get his lantern, and out of the shadows stepped a Hawaiian man with a gun and shot him in the heart. Point blank. And his sister Emma, who was in the next room, in bed, just about ready to fall asleep, heard the whole thing. She heard the knock, and she heard her brother say, "Who's there?" She heard the grunt, and then the gunshot. She was in her brother Jared's room within seconds, and she saw him in the doorway with both hands on his chest, bent over, and then saw him fall back into the bedroom and lay on the floor. Suddenly, the other sister who lived in the house came and sat on the floor with Jared's head in her lap. He took 3 breaths and died. The community was in shock. This church community was in shock. He was a member of the Protestant Congregational Church. His dad was one of their preachers and beloved physician for the island who came here to serve mainly the Hawaiian people. No one could believe that anyone would do anything to harm Jared Knapp Smith, much less kill him. Well, the next day, news reached Honolulu by boat, and Jared's brother, W.O. Smith, happened to be the Attorney General for the Republic of Hawaii. He and his very best people who look into matters like this, forget the name of these people. What's that? The investigators. But they came over on the next boat, and it didn't take them much time to find out what had happened. Just a few days before that horrible evening, a woman by the name of Pau Pau came to Jared Knapp Smith with her daughter Pua, and they had something wrong with their skin, and he determined that they probably had leprosy and needed to go to Honolulu to the holding place, which meant they would probably end up on Kalaupapa, that peninsula on the north shore of Molokai, where the government sent anyone that might have leprosy to suffer and die without ever getting to see their family or people in their community ever again. They were dropped off there with very little besides the clothes on their back and maybe one box or a suitcase or a bag to carry with them. This woman, Pau Pau, and her daughter, Pua, 13 years old, were afraid for their lives. They didn't want to leave their family. They didn't want to leave their communities. So Pau Pau went home and told her lover, Kaio, what had happened. And he got together with 2 of his nephews and said, we got to kill Dr. Smith because he's the one that has this information, and if we kill him, then our beloved family members won't have to go to Kalaupapa. Well, unfortunately for them, W.O. Smith and his investigators were pretty sharp and figured things out really quickly, and 6 months later, the one who pulled the trigger hung in a jail in Honolulu. Now, as I was reading this story yet again this week, a story I've read a few other times, it occurred to me that when people are forced to leave their family and the only community they know, when they realize that shame is going to be placed upon them by the powers that be, they do crazy things. Every time I read this story, I get emotional. Every time I think about it, I get tears in the back of my eyes because there's so much wrong with this story, including how people were treated who had not just leprosy, but any skin disease that might be leprosy. The people that had leprosy were treated like animals. Now, in this morning's scripture lesson from Luke, which we just read a few moments ago, a man with leprosy approached Jesus. And let me give you a little background about how some things take a long time to change. This was some 2,000 years ago. In the society where Jesus lived, if you had leprosy, there were strict laws, just like there were here in Hawaii in the late 1800s. And here were just a few of those laws. If you had leprosy, or even if the priest thought you had leprosy, you weren't allowed to wear whole pieces of clothing. If you had a shirt or pants or anything long, you had to cut it in strips. And what this symbolized for the people who had these dreadful skin diseases was that society considered them unwhole, just like their clothing was unwhole. And what it did for the society at large is when they would see someone with leprosy at a distance, they would see all of the cut clothing and know to stay away, to keep their distance. The other thing, by law, that people had to do if the priest determined that they had leprosy, they could never comb their hair or brush it. In fact, they had to mess up their hair so at a distance, all the rest of society would see the cut up clothing and the messed up hair and know that's a leper. Keep your distance. And lepers could never approach anyone. In fact, if you had leprosy and someone didn't notice all the cut clothing and all the messed up hair, you had to cover your mouth. And by law, you had to call out twice, unclean, unclean, so that people at a distance would be certain that you were an outcast, that you weren't worthy to be in their presence, and to heap shame and guilt upon these poor lives. If you were unclean by law, you weren't able to enter a temple or a synagogue. In other words, in today's language, you couldn't come into a church. You were told that you were banned by God. You weren't welcome in God's presence. You were unwhole. You were unclean. You were messed up just like your hair. You can't be in the midst of where God is. And so this man had great courage and a lot of gall to not shout out, unclean, unclean, but instead, Jesus, if you will, if you choose, make me clean. Not unclean, unclean, but please make me clean. What we don't realize when we read that passage, by that man simply doing that one act, he was breaking the law. By law, all he could say is unclean, unclean, and keep his distance. He came within shouting distance, maybe speaking distance of Jesus, and said, make me clean. I want you to know that Jesus also broke the law because it was illegal to touch a leper. By law, you could not. In fact, if you touched someone who had leprosy, you instantly took on their uncleanliness. You too had to be separated from God in the mind and in the hearts of the religious community. By touching the man, Jesus himself became unclean. He became a person of leprosy. He was willing to look like a messed up person that was unwhole, that was unclean, because, and here's the key word, he chose to see the man differently. And that word chose is right there in this morning's scriptures. The man said, Jesus, if you choose, make me clean. And Jesus said, I do choose. We all have the option to choose to see every single person in the world as a beloved child of God created in the image of God. We also can choose to see people as unclean and messed up and unwhole and not worthy to be in our presence and not worthy of God's love. We get to choose, each and every one of us. But Jesus gave us the example of what to do when we see someone that society says you're not worthy. It may be an immigrant, a refugee, lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgender. Wherever you want to say there are labels in our society for people, Jesus is basically saying to us in this morning's passage, we get to choose if we want to see that person on the margins of society as an unclean, messed up, unworthy person, or beloved, child of God, God's dear one. 2 weeks ago, I had the privilege of being at Kōloa with my son. And the image that stands out in my mind is being at Kōloa. So imagine Molokai with this very northern flat, relatively flat peninsula on the very north shore. On the north, I guess on your side, it would be the, I'm trying to think, mirror image here. For me, it would be over here, so the northeast corner. So for you, imagine over here, where the seas are rough and the wind blows like crazy, Kōloa is the name of this ancient Hawaiian village where the government basically said, all you people that have been here for all this time, go somewhere else because the lepers are coming. I stood there with Palani, and I thought to myself, I was here 30 years ago, and I'm having the same thoughts. When I went 30 years ago, I was with my sister. This time I was with my son, and I stood there looking at these emerald, magnificent cliffs. By the way, they are the highest sea cliffs in the world, and they are stunning. And this little island, just several yards out from the cliff, emerald green and stunning. And I remember thinking, this is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in my life. Indeed, in my mind, possibly the most beautiful place in all of Hawaii. It is just breathtaking to stand there. And then to think that this was the most dreaded place of all. If you had leprosy or even a skin disease that might be leprous. And I remember thinking, isn't that just like the human experience? Sometimes in our darkest moments, we are surrounded by beauty, and God shows up. In the beauty, in the pain, in the midst of shame that we humans dump on other people, God showed up at Kōloa. I didn't realize this until about a year ago, but that very same year, 1866, where the first people with leprosy were sent there in exile, a congregational church appeared in their midst. And they came together, and they worshiped God and thanked God for the beauty. And God showed up. God loved them. Even though the rest of the society cast them out and said, you're not welcome among us. That image will stay with me, I'm sure, for the rest of my life. Horror, tragedy, darkness, and yet God's light rose up in their midst. We get to choose how we see those people in our society that are cast aside, that are labeled. Over and over again through the scriptures, we are invited to cast aside all the labels and see each and every person as God sees them. And I'm reminded of our baptismal vows that we were given when we were either baptized as infants or that we spoke out loud when we were baptized as teenagers or adults. The words of Jesus, or the words of God actually upon Jesus' baptism, this is my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. My beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Those aren't words just for Jesus, but for each and every one of us and for each and every person outside these walls, whoever they are. We are all God's beloved. And Jesus, by example and by word, reminds us over and over and over again, treat one another accordingly. I want to say that one of my greatest privileges in life has been to be the pastor here of Kōloa Union Church, because out of all the places I've served, I see that here at least as much as any place I've ever been. Much more than other places I've been, because people in this community are willing to love people for who they are willing to see God's image in each and every person, regardless of their socioeconomic status or their religion or their sexual orientation. We here love one another because we see one another as God sees each and every one of us. A child of God, God's beloved, whole. Amen.